Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to the Fantasy Football Prodigy channel. And in this video, I'm going to give you my top stardoms and situms for week 17 of the 2021 fantasy football season. This video and this week of fantasy are very important because obviously this is championship week for a lot of leagues out there. And even if you're not in the championship, maybe you're competing for third place or you're in a consolation bracket. So you still want to make the right stardom and situm calls in those situations as well. And also, even if you're out of it completely, it's always a good idea to stay up to date with what's going on in the NFL so that you can be ready for next season. So without further ado, let's get right into my stardoms. I'll go position by position and then we'll move on to the situms. So I'm going to begin with my stardom quarterbacks. I got two players to talk about. The first one is Matthew Stafford of the Los Angeles Rams. I really like him this week. Now, I did make him a stardom last week in a great matchup with my Minnesota Vikings, and he flat out stunk. He only had 9.7 points according to Fantasy Pros. He had 3 interceptions. It was just a bad game. And honestly, sometimes players just have bad games. And I think Matthew Stafford is a good player. And I do think that he will bounce back this week. He's taking on the Baltimore Ravens, who are a fantastic matchup. And they just gave up over 500 passing yards and 4 passing touchdowns to Joe Burrow of the Cincinnati Bengals. If you look at the Ravens on the season, according to this chart, they're giving up the second most points on the season to quarterbacks, the third most over the last 5 weeks, and the second most over the last 3 weeks. So they've been a smash matchup all year long. And for me, Matthew Stafford is a quarterback one play with a ton of upside this week in championship week. My next stardom quarterback is Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. Did you guys see what Dak Prescott and the Cowboys just did to Washington last week? Well, now Jalen Hurts, coming off of an okay but not great week for fantasy, is taking on that same Washington defense. Now, Dak Prescott just annihilated them, but the week before that, it was Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles that took them on. And what did he do? He put up almost 300 passing yards, threw a touchdown. He ran in 2 more scores, and he put up 28.6 fantasy points according to this chart. I believe he was the quarterback 3 on the week. That week. So long story short, he just shredded this defense 2 weeks ago. We saw this defense get annihilated last week. So for week 17, I really like Jalen Hurts. He is always in play because of his ability to be productive both through the air and on the ground. And this week in championship week, I like him as a quarterback one play. And even outside of the last 2 weeks, this Washington football team has been atrocious against fantasy quarterbacks, meaning that they've given up a lot of points to fantasy quarterbacks. On the season, they're giving up the most points to quarterbacks in all of fantasy. They're giving up the second most points to quarterbacks in fantasy over the last 5 weeks. And over the last 3 weeks, they're giving up the most points to quarterbacks in all of fantasy. So long story short, it's a great matchup. Fire up Jalen Hurts. Now I'm going to move on to my stardom running backs. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is Ronald Jones of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He is once again, just like last week, going to be filling in for an injured Leonard Fournette, who is not going to be playing in this game. He saw plenty of volume and had a good fantasy game last week against a good Panthers defense in that starting role. 20 for 65 on the ground. He had a rushing touchdown. Not the most efficient in terms of yards per carry, but again, he saw a ton of volume. He caught a couple passes and he put up 15.1 points in half PPR. I did make him a stardom last week and he came through. And now he gets the best matchup in all of fantasy, arguably, for running backs as he takes on the New York Jets. So I'm once again going to be making him a stardom running back. And I'm even more confident this week than I was last week because we've seen him get the volume. We saw him succeed in a tough matchup. Now he gets a great matchup against the New York Jets. If you look at what they've done on the season, they're giving up the most points to running backs on the season. Over the last 5 weeks, they've given up the 4th most, and then they've given up the 5th most points to running backs over the last 3 weeks. So all year long, the Jets have been a great matchup, and I'm expecting a running back one performance out of Ronald Jones. My next stardom running back is Damien Harris of the New England Patriots. In week 16, he had a monster game against the Bills, 18 for 103 on the ground, 3 rushing touchdowns, 28.3 points in half PPR. Just an unbelievable performance. Obviously, that was without fellow Patriots running back Ramondre Stevenson, who should be back this week, but I still like Damien Harris in week 17 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. He went off last week, and he's been a good fantasy player in general for most of the season. Now he takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars in New England. It's a home game. That's huge. In a game that I expect the Patriots to win easily. He projects to be a part of the reason for any success the Patriots have on offense. And if the game script goes the way I expect with the New England Patriots leading, his workload on the ground should be very secure in this one, especially later in the game as they wind down the clock. The Jaguars, in terms of points given up to running backs, are not a smash matchup. They're kind of in the middle of the of the league, but just with the game script, with how good Damien Harris has been, and just the fact that it's a home game, I think that the Patriots will be able to run the ball in this one, and Damien Harris has been so good for fantasy. I like him as a low running back one play this week. My next stardom running back is more of a team-based play than really one individual player, and what I mean by that is I'm going to recommend starting whoever the 49ers starting running back is. So if Elijah Mitchell returns from injury and is back on the field with no limitations, he should dominate in a fantastic matchup with the Houston Texans. As a starter, you can see some of the games he has had over the course of the season. He's been really good for fantasy. So if he comes back from injury and he's not limited, obviously monitor the news. I'm recording this on Thursday, so just, keep up with what the updates are with that situation in San Francisco. But if he starts and he's the clear starter, he should dominate in this one. But if he does not play, if Elijah Mitchell is out, Jeff Wilson of the 49ers should be their starting running back, and I'm confident that he too would also find success in that role in a great matchup. Jeff Wilson has filled in for some games that Elijah Mitchell has missed, and you can see, especially over the last couple weeks, that's a role that he has actually found some good success in. So in week 17 against the Houston Texans, who over the course of the season, they're giving up the second most points to running backs, the second most over the last 5 weeks, and the third most over the last 3 weeks. It's a great matchup. So in that matchup, whoever the starter is, I would be very confident in playing them as basically a running back one. If Elijah Mitchell is ready to go and he gets the full workload, I'm a little bit more confident in him just because we've seen him over the course of the season have those big games. But Jeff Wilson, like I said, he's been good lately too. So either way, they're kind of like this running back one, high running back two type of play. Just remember, monitor the news, but either way, both would be a great start depending on who the starter is for the 49ers against the Texans. Next up, I have another player to talk about that is also kind of dependent on an injury situation. So I'm going to talk about Darrel Williams, running back of the Kansas City Chiefs. So this is only a stardom that I'm going to recommend if Clyde Edwards-Helaire is out for this game. He is obviously their normal starting running back, but if he is out, Darrel Williams will step in and be the starter, a role that he has already had success in this season while Clyde missed some time earlier in the year. He's taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, who it's not the greatest matchup. They've been pretty good against running backs, but again, it's just a matter of seeing an increase in opportunity for this guy who's a backup running back. I thought it's worth bringing him up to let you guys know that this is someone that might be worth starting. And also important to note is that in games that Clyde Edwards-Helaire has missed, Andy Reid and the Chiefs have shown a willingness to get Darrel Williams involved in the passing game. So especially if you're playing in a PPR format, I think Darrel Williams is a pretty safe bet for at least a handful of targets. Hopefully he catches them and does something with them. But yeah, if he is the starter, for me, he is a nice little running back to play that you can use in week 17. And yet again, we have another running back stardom that I'm going to talk about that is also dependent on some injury news. So there's kind of some pros and cons to deciding on when I post these videos. Sometimes I wait until closer to Sunday so that some of the murkiness with some players gets kind of resolved, but then you don't have as much time to watch the video. Whereas if I post it earlier in the week, I'm posting this on either Thursday or Friday. I'm recording it on Thursday. I'll probably post it right after recording it. You have more time to see the video, but a lot could change by game time. So with COVID and stuff, obviously, with that and all the injuries, you always want to monitor the news and just make sure that what I'm saying in this video aligns with what the reports are on Sunday, okay? So as of now, as of this recording, if James Conner is out for this game, I like Chase Edmonds as a solid play, a solid start against the Dallas Cowboys in Week 17. James Conner did miss last week, and Chase Edmonds had a great game against a good Colts defense. As of this recording, we don't know if James Conner is going to play. There is a good chance that he does miss the game. So if he misses the game, Chase Edmonds will once again be the starter. And if he is out again, the opportunity is too good to not bring Chase Edmonds up as a stardom, even against a Dallas defense that has been really solid, really great lately, actually. They're generating tons of turnovers, getting some big plays. So it's not a matchup-based play. It's more of an opportunity-based play, kind of like what I was talking about with Darrel Williams. But if Chase Edmonds does have the backfield to himself, he is a running back 2 for me in championship week. We have finally reached our last stardom running back, and that's going to be Rashaad Penny, running back of the Seattle Seahawks. He has been really solid for fantasy lately. If you look in week 14 in a good matchup with Houston, he put up 26.3 points in half PPR. He saw 16 carries on the ground. You love to see that. Then week 15, a tougher matchup against the Rams, 11 for 39 on the ground. Not a ton in the passing game, only 5.4 points. But then in week 16 against the Bears, he had a nice little bounce back game, 17 for 135 yards and a touchdown on the ground. 19 and a half points in fantasy and half PPR. So that's awesome. Now in week 17, championship week, he takes on the Detroit Lions, who I probably don't even need to show you this chart, but just in case you're not aware, it's a good matchup for running backs. They're giving up the 4th most points on the season to running backs, middle of the pack the last 5 weeks, I guess, and then 10th most to running backs over the last 3 weeks. So it's a good matchup. Especially when you look at them on the course of the season. And he's been their lead running back in Seattle, so he should see the volume, and he should be able to exploit this matchup. So for me, Rashaad Penny is a quality running back to play this week. So we worked through the running backs. Now I'm going to talk about my stardom wide receivers. I don't have as many wide receivers to talk about as I did running backs, but we're going to start with Antonio Brown, wide receiver of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I made him a stardom last week against the Panthers, and he had a great week in his first game back from injury and suspension. As you can see, he saw 15 targets, caught 10 of them for 101 yards. And even without a touchdown, he still had a nice little game for fantasy with 15 points. Now he takes on the Jets. And even though I do expect the Buccaneers to win this game easily and not necessarily need to air it out for all 4 quarters, I think Antonio Brown should still see enough target volume to be successful. The Jets won't be able to cover Antonio Brown, and with Chris Godwin still out, he is a safe bet for good production with some upside depending on how much the Buccaneers decide to throw the ball. If you look at on the season, the Jets aren't giving up the most points to wide receivers. To me, that's more of a case of teams choosing to run the ball on the Jets and being up early and being able to run out the clock, right? It's not necessarily a case where the Jets have a good secondary. So that sort of game script thing is the only thing that really worries me about the passing game for the Buccaneers. But I think Antonio Brown, especially with Chris Godwin out, I think he should be able to see enough targets in this game, and he doesn't need a lot of them to do good things against the New York Jets. So for me, I like him as a wide receiver 1, whether or not fellow Bucks wide receiver Mike Evans returns or not. So either way, I like him as a nice wide receiver 1 play in championship week. My next stardom wide receiver is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, and let's just be honest, he has been really, really good lately. It was an ugly game for both offenses last week against the Saints, but even then, Jalen Waddle still came through with a huge game. He continues to see heavy target volume, and he continues to do great things with those targets that he is seeing. So against a Titans defense that can be exploited, I like Jalen Waddle as a great wide receiver to play. On the course of the season, the Titans are giving up the 3rd most points to wide receivers. They've had stretches where they've improved their defense a little bit, seemingly at times, but even over the last 5 weeks, they're giving up the 12th most points to wide receivers. They're kind of middle of the pack over the last 3 weeks. So I think this is a defense that Jalen Waddle can exploit. And like I said, I like him as a really, really nice wide receiver to play this week. And my third and final stardom wide receiver is Amon-Ra St. Brown. So he had been hot for fantasy from weeks 13 to 15. But then in week 16, all right, Jared Goff, the Lions starting quarterback, was out for that game. So I was a little bit hesitant about Amon-Ra St. Brown if he could get it done, even in a good matchup with the Atlanta Falcons in week 16. But he proved me wrong, and he had a great game, even with the backup quarterback in. He's been awesome the last 4 weeks. And in those 4 weeks, he has seen at least 11 targets in each of those games. You can see 12, 12, 11, 11. So that shows that this isn't a fluky thing where he's just making one big play. He's seen consistent high target volume, and you love to see that out of a fantasy wide receiver. So that is great to see. This week against an exploitable Seahawks defense, I do expect him to continue seeing targets and be good for fantasy. Even though the Seahawks have been more of a team that you want to attack on the ground, I don't think the Lions are really going to be in a situation where they're able to just run out the clock all game. I think they'll at least need to throw the ball in a little bit, even if it's just a competitive game. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown will still see his targets. So for me, he is a wide receiver to play in week 17. Now I have 2 tight end stardoms to talk about for week 17, and the first one is Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. I talked about Jalen Hurts in this game, so hopefully Hurts finds Goedert for some big plays in week 17 against the Washington football team. Dallas Goedert had been hot before the bye week and after the bye week. He had some really, really massive games, but then last week against the New York Giants. He really cooled off. I do believe he did have a touchdown called back. I think I did hear that. So he could have had a better game, but either way, only 2 catches, 3.8 points in half PPR, so that wasn't great. But I do expect to bounce back in Week 17, where he takes on a Washington defense that he just destroyed a couple weeks ago. And the Washington football team, like I said earlier, last week against the Cowboys just annihilated that defense. Dallas Goedert just annihilated that same defense in Week 15. So for me, Dallas Goedert is a mid-tight end 1 start in Week 17 in that same matchup with Washington. Next, in an attempt to give you a waiver wire or non-elite option, I'm going to make Gerald Everett, tight end of the Seattle Seahawks, a stardom. If you are in the championship with a guy like Mark Andrews or Travis Kelce, then obviously you stick with a player like that, one of those top tier guys, right? But maybe you've been streaming tight ends all season, or maybe you just recently lost TJ Hawkinson a few weeks back, and you're still trying to replace that production. I think Gerald Everett is a solid play if that description matches your situation. He's been involved and good for fantasy at times this year since their bye week in Week 9, and he's been a good play each of the last 3 weeks, 9.8, 8, 14.8. At this level of tight end, that's pretty good production, right? Because the tight end position is disgusting. Now, in Week 17, he gets a good matchup with the Detroit Lions, who have been known to give up points in general to offenses, and particularly to tight ends. If you look at on the course of the season, giving up the 10th most points over the last 5 weeks, giving up the 2nd most points to tight ends, and they're giving up the 3rd most points to tight ends over the last 3 weeks. So it's a good matchup. At this level of tight end, any player is susceptible, that's a hard word to say, to a less than stellar game, but I do still like him as a low tight end 1, high tight end 2 this week if you don't have one of those top options. So those are all of my stardoms. Now we're going to move on to my situms, and I have 2 quarterbacks to talk about. The first one is Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. You probably aren't considering playing Trevor Lawrence unless you're really desperate. Maybe you're in a 2 quarterback league and don't have another option, and that's a tough situation, right? But I'm just going to recommend that you stay away from Trevor Lawrence if possible in Week 17 against the New England Patriots. He has done nothing for fantasy in his rookie season, and while I do think he still has plenty of opportunity to grow into a good NFL quarterback in the long run, you really can't consider playing him in championship week. A lot of people are always too quick to close the book on a player when they don't have a great rookie year. I think we just got to wait and see with what Trevor Lawrence does, in the future, in the coming years. But I would not play him against the Patriots in Week 17. Trevor Lawrence has thrown a combined 2 touchdown passes since their Week 7 bye. And if you don't believe me, here's their bye week in Week 7. Here are the touchdown passes. He had 1 against Seattle in Week 8. 0, 0, 0. 1 against Atlanta. 0, 0, 0, 0. He has not thrown a touchdown pass in his last 4 games. If you look at his rushing touchdowns, he hasn't run one in since his bye week either. So he's scored 2 touchdowns in 9 games. You cannot play a player like that ever, even in a good matchup. But in a tough matchup against New England, he's going to be going into New England, and he's taking on that tough Patriots defense. I would really recommend staying away. On top of that, not to mention that the Patriots coach, Bill Belichick, has a long history of making it really difficult for rookie quarterbacks to succeed. Rookie quarterbacks are usually shut down by Bill Belichick and his defenses. So I wouldn't even want to start him even in a good matchup. But this week, he is pretty much unplayable. It hurts to say this as someone who drafted him in the first round of a dynasty rookie draft, but I wouldn't even consider him in a 2 quarterback league this week unless you literally had no other remotely decent option. My next sit-em quarterback is Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. He hasn't been good for fantasy in a while. I mean, look at what he's done since their bye week. He had an 18-point game, a 28.5-point game against the Saints, and other than that, since then, it's really been very bad to mediocre. So I don't know why anyone would even want to play Matt Ryan in any scenario. But this week especially, he takes on the Bills defense outdoors on the road. Matt Ryan, he plays for the Falcons in a dome. That doesn't mean he can't succeed, in the cold environment. But even in a dome, he hasn't been great for fantasy. So on the road, in the cold, against a tough Bills defense, I would just recommend staying away from Matt Ryan. If possible this week. Now I'm going to move on to my sit-em running backs, and the first one is Chuba Hubbard. I made him a sit-em last week, and it was a good call as he did nothing in a brutal matchup with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now he takes on the Saints, another tough run defense, so I would recommend sitting him this week as well. In terms of what the Saints have done to fantasy running backs on the season. They're giving up the second fewest points to running backs. The fewest are the Buccaneers, who he played last week and did nothing against. The Saints have been tough over the last 5 and 3 weeks as well, so they've been good against running backs all season long. I said it last week, and I will reiterate again this week for anyone that didn't hear my last video. Even though Christian McCaffrey is out for the season, Chuba Hubbard is not their workhorse running back. It's not take out McCaffrey and just slot Chuba Hubbard in. That's not how this has been. Amir Abdullah, a fellow running back for the Panthers, is also quite involved, particularly in the passing game for the Panthers. On top of that, not to mention that Cam Newton is also always a threat to run down or to run in any goal line opportunities that might otherwise have gone to Chuba Hubbard. So splitting snaps on a bad offense in a bad matchup with the Saints, no thanks, I'll stay away. And I was just talking about how good the Buccaneers' run defense has been this season. They just shut down Chuba Hubbard. They usually shut down their running backs or whatever running back they face. And Michael Carter is taking on that defense this week, running back of the New York Jets, Michael Carter. And he's not a must sit, but after a big game against the Jaguars last week, I just thought I should bring him up so that I could let you guys know that I would temper your expectations this week in a much tougher matchup this week with the Buccaneers, much tougher than the Jacksonville Jaguars, who they played last week. On top of the Buccaneers having a great run defense, I do expect the Buccaneers to be leading the majority of this game, meaning that Michael Carter could see some limited rushing work as the Jets might need to throw the ball a little bit more in an attempt to come back in this game. This isn't Jacksonville where, the Jets actually won that game. There's not many teams that the Jets can beat. The Jaguars are one of those teams that they can beat, and he was able to see 16 carries on the ground. That's some really nice volume. But Michael Carter has shown an ability to get involved and be productive in the passing game, but a lot of that production came when Zach Wilson, the current Jets starting quarterback, was out, and Mike White was the signal caller for the Jets. Zach Wilson hasn't really thrown the ball to Michael Carter that much. He does have these big target games, but Zach Wilson hasn't really been willing to show him those type of targets. 2 targets a couple weeks ago, 3 targets last week. So he's one of those guys that if he doesn't get it done on the ground, and he doesn't get the targets, how is he going to get his production? So for me, he is still a running back 3. So it is possible, depending on your injury and your COVID situation, that he still might be your best option. But I just want to bring him up because I do not view him as a must start by any means, even though he's coming off of a big game. And he does have huge bust potential if his rushing work is limited and if he doesn't see many targets in the passing game. My final sit-em running back is Devonta Freeman of the Baltimore Ravens. There was a time this season when he was a solid flex play, but that volume, it just hasn't been there lately. The last couple weeks, 6 carries each of the last 2 weeks, 1 reception, 2 receptions, just not a lot of volume. It's becoming more of a committee there, it seems like. Latavius Murray is a little bit more involved. And now he's taking on a tough Rams defense. And for me, he's just a touchdown dependent running back 3/running back 4 play at best. So for my sit-em wide receivers, the first person I'm going to talk about is really 2 people. It's a duo of teammates, and that's going to be Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. I'm going to make both of them sit-ems this week. And if you haven't already caught on, this Denver Broncos wide receiver duo has been horrible for fantasy. They had a couple games early on in the season, but since then, just nothing for fantasy. Sutton did have some nice games early in the season while Jerry Jeudy missed time with an injury, but since Judy's return, they have really been nothing but putrid. You can see what Jeudy has done, even in half PPR. 9 points is pretty much his ceiling. And then taking a look at Courtland Sutton, honestly, it's been even worse for Courtland Sutton. In Week 16 against the Raiders, Courtland Sutton had 33 yards, and that was his highest yardage total since Week 8, where he had 40. Look at his points in half PPR. He's just been unusable. I do have both of them in my Dynasty League, and after several injuries and COVID situations left me without some of my top options in that league, I decided to pick up and play Laquan Treadwell over Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy, who I have in that Dynasty League. And while Laquan Treadwell had an okay game, Jeudy ended up with a few receptions and 60 yards. That just kind of illustrates how bad the situation is for these Broncos receivers. Now they take on the Chargers, who have been tough on wide receivers this season. Well, giving up more points to running backs on the ground. So I do think that the Broncos could try to lean on the run in this game. Both Courtland, Sutton and Jerry Jeudy are talented enough to randomly make a play and have a good game. But based on what they have done over the second half of the season, they really are nothing more than wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 options. And my final sit-em player and final player that I'm going to talk about in this video is Terry McLaurin of the Washington football team. I made him a sit-em a couple weeks ago in this matchup with the Eagles. And this week, I'm again going to make him a sit-em in the matchup with the Eagles. He's crazy talented and can always make some plays and have a good game for fantasy. But based on his production this season in this Washington offense, it's really risky to start him. Plus, when you factor in that the Philadelphia Eagles have been a nightmare for fantasy wide receivers, I would be wary of Terry. Yes, I did mean to rhyme that. On the course of the season, the Eagles are giving up the second fewest points to wide receivers. They're giving up the third fewest points to wide receivers over the last 5 weeks. And over the last 3 weeks, they're giving up the fewest points in the entire league to wide receivers in fantasy football. Terry McLaurin is still a wide receiver 3, just based on his talent. He can always break a big play. But it is very, very possible that you have better options at this point. And if you look at what he's done, man, I mean, he has bust potential, right? He's had a couple, a few good games this year since their bye week. He's really had one great game for fantasy. So he's definitely not a must start. And I bet, especially if you're in the championship, that you probably have better options. I don't like how this website is trying to distract the viewer from what I'm saying with this ad, but yeah. I would not recommend playing Terry. So those were all of my stardoms and sit-ems for week 17. Now I'm just going to quickly review our calls from week 16 because I think it's important to look back and see what we did well and what we didn't do well. So last week I liked Matt Stafford and Justin Herbert as my starting quarterbacks. Justin Herbert did pretty well, quarterback 9, 18.94 points. Stafford, however, even in a good matchup with my Vikings, he had a total collapse. Quarterback 24 in the week, only 9.68 points. That was a colossal disappointment. At the running back position, I made James Robinson a stardom in a good matchup with the Jets. He only had 1 point, but we really don't know if this call would have been good or not because 3 carries into the game, he tore his Achilles. So I still think it would have been a good call, but when a guy gets injured after 3 touches, it's hard for him to have a good game. And also, prayers up for James Robinson. I am a big fan of his, with not just kind of an underdog story. I hope he comes back from that horrific injury. But moving on, we got Cordarrelle Patterson. I liked him as a good running back 1 play against the Lions. Luckily, he got in the end zone. And even then, he only had 7.8 points, the running back 31 on the week. So that was a disappointment, even though he did still get a touchdown. Definitely did not meet expectations. Ronald Jones, however, I made him a stardom last week as a RB1. And he finished as an RB1, the running back 12 on the week, 15.1 points. So started to turn things around a little bit. That was a good call. David Montgomery, I liked him last week as a running back 1, and he was the running back 1, finished as the running back 7 with 20.1 points. And then I said I liked Justin Jackson, especially if Austin Eckler was out. Eckler was out, and Justin Jackson finished as the running back 1 on the week with 30.2 points. So that was as good of a call as you can get. At wide receiver, I recommended playing Antonio Brown. I liked him as a wide receiver 1. And while he wasn't a wide receiver 1, he still had a really good week. 15.1 points in half PPR. So that was a good call. And then a bad call. I said I liked Russell Gage. I feel like every time I start to buy into Russell Gage after doubting him, he hits us with a bad game. And that's what happened again. He finished as the wide receiver 76 with only 3.9 points. So that was definitely a miss on my part. At tight end, I went with a little under the radar stardom with Kmet. I liked him as a tight end 2, and he finished as the tight end 15. So he was a tight end 2, 6.9 points. So that was a pretty decent call. And then moving on to my sit-ems from last week, Chuba Hubbard was my sit-em running back, and that was a good call. He finished as the running back 78 with only 0.9 points, so that was most definitely a good call. And then Myles Gaskin, I said to sit him. I didn't like him as anything more than running back 4, and he finished with a horrible game, running back 65 on the week with only 2.1 points, so that was a great call for the Fantasy Football Prodigy channel. And that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel for more fantasy football content, and good luck in Week 17. I hope you guys bring home some championships. Let me know in the comments down below if you do bring home some hardware. All right? Peace out.